Hi, I'm Dr. Cavan, if I haven't met you already. And what I'm going to do tonight is a little bit of recording about chapters 1, 2, and 3. So if you weren't able to join us last week when we discussed those in a Zoom meeting, here's a little recording about those. I think I'm going to do three small recordings, just a little discussion of each of those, and then we're going to have a test here in the next couple of days. You'll have a couple of days to take it. And this is just to help you with your understanding of those, kind of a review. And then I'll continue to do those Zoom meetings where we can meet as a group as you desire. And then I'll try to post those. I didn't have any luck posting the one from last week, but that's why I'm doing these instead. We'll try to post those in future weeks. And I won't have to redo them. So that's the point of this. And so I'm going to just zip through the PowerPoints that are on Blackboard. You can follow along with those if you'd like, or look at them at your leisure. So I'm going to look at the first two PowerPoints, Chapter 1, A and B right now on this particular video. So let's look at this first PowerPoint that goes along with Chapter 1. And it begins by talking about some vocabulary that's important to the discussion of disabilities. We've got some words here: impairment, disability, handicap. Probably the most important concept here is the difference between disability and handicap. Impairment and disability kind of go hand in hand, talking about the loss or limitation that a person may have. But the key concept that we want to get here is that a handicap is not a word that we use to talk about a disability. In years gone by, that's probably what you are familiar with and what you've heard. Say that a person has a handicap, but that's not the verbiage that we like to use these days. A handicap is instead of something that a person has, it's the result of external factors that we as a society put onto a person. And so a person has a disability. That's the limitation that they have, whether it's blindness or deafness or a learning disability or a speech impairment or a traumatic brain injury or some other kind of disabling characteristic. But a handicap is what we as a society put on that person by not allowing them access or some other kind of enabling ability to access things that they need to be able to get around in this world. And your book expounds on that a bit, but handicap is the word that we don't want to use to describe a person. The next thing here is a description of person-first language, and that's a very important concept that you need to get a handle on here early in the course, and that is that we don't talk about a disability and then just use it to describe a person. We don't say that blind boy or that deaf girl or that autistic person. We always say the person first. That person who has a disability, that the boy who has autism, or the girl who is blind. We talk about the person first, and not the disability before we talk about the person. A person is not defined by their disability, and so we don't begin by talking about the disability as though it's the defining characteristic. So those are a few important points about exceptionalities. The next slide talks a little bit about the two-pronged disability test. Just because a person has a disability doesn't mean they're automatically eligible for special education services across our country. You have to have the presence of a disability, but then you also have to have an adverse effect on educational performance that's caused by that disability in order to be eligible for special education services. And so in theory, a person could have a disability. Let's say a person could have deafness, perhaps. But unless that disability rose to the level of adversely affecting that person's education, then there might not be eligibility for special education. The disability would have to be strong enough that it was causing an adverse effect on educational performance. Now, usually deafness does, but it's possible that some disabilities might not be profound enough that they impact the student to such a degree that they need specialized instruction. Here's a list of a few laws that impact people with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1990, and it's one that impacts all people with disabilities, whether they're in school or adults. And that's the one that determines that we have to provide access for people. That's the one that determines that all of our restrooms have to be accessible, our buildings have to be accessible. Anything that receives entity or organization that receives federal funding has to be accessible to all. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is the law that mandates what happens in schools, early childhood through grade 12, for students who have disabilities. And then Section 504 is a component of the Rehab Act of 1973 that enables people who have certain disabilities to get accommodations. Those that don't rise to the level of needing special education may still get some accommodations in a public school setting. Now, we have a national average of over 11%, going on 12% of people who have disabilities in our public schools. But for a long time here in Texas, the Texas Education Agency has told school districts that they needed to keep their special education numbers around 8.5%. And that has recently come under a lot of fire from some of the larger school districts in Texas who have had a real hard time trying to meet that goal of 8.5%. And as such, they've started to make some noise about it. And the Office of Civil Rights has gotten involved. And the Texas Education Agency has, like I said, come under fire. And they have lightened up on that. And things are changing in Texas. I expect that over the next couple of years, probably, we'll get back closer to that national average, which is much more descriptive of our true population. Now, there are actually 13 disabilities, and I'm going to post a kind of a little test on Blackboard to let you see what the actual disabilities are, and test yourself, see if you know what they are. And then over the next few chapters in the book, we'll actually delve into what those disability categories are. There is some fluctuation. We have what we call high incidence disabilities and low incidence disabilities. The high incidence disabilities are those that are more frequently occurring, and low incidence are less frequently occurring. So our high incidence disabilities, the most high incidence disability is a specific learning disability. Some of you may even have a learning disability, and that's where you have problems in math, reading, or written language, or oral language, and that impacts the way you perform in school. And some of you may even receive accommodations in the university setting, particularly if you have difficulty in reading. That's the most common of all of the learning disabilities, and you may even receive some accommodations. You may get copies of class notes. You may get extended time on tests so you can take your time in reading your test questions, things like that. That's a reading disability. And some of you may have that. It doesn't mean that a person has a low IQ. That's another disability altogether. That's a cognitive disability or an intellectual impairment. And that's something different altogether. People who have learning disabilities have average IQs or above. But then we have low incidence disabilities. Those are things like deafness and blindness or traumatic brain injuries, things that are very infrequently occurring. Some of our lower incidence disabilities, autism for one, has become higher. So there is some fluctuation in those disabilities. And it's interesting to consider why. One of the reasons why is because we're getting better at determining disabilities. Our evaluation methods are better. Some people think that autism, for one, might actually be on the rise. And there's not a whole lot of evidence to substantiate that claim. The likelihood is more probable that we're just noticing it more and we're getting better at identifying it. But there's a lot of theories out there about some of these things. It's important to note that special education is a service. It's not a place. It's a service that it can occur in a lot of different places. And it can happen in a regular classroom. It can happen in a special education classroom. It can happen in a speech therapy room. It can happen on a playground, in a gym. Lots of different ways, lots of different places. And so it's important to recognize that and to understand the width and breadth of special education. And it's not just a special room down the hall where kids with wheelchairs are. It's not that at all. And that's what one of the points of this course is to help you understand some of those nuances about special education. And that's the end of 1A. So now I want you to flip over to chapter 1B, and we'll go over that one quickly. It begins with a history of special education and some of the concepts that go along with that. And so I'm not going to belabor that too much because you can read about some of these historians in the field in your book. It goes into quite a bit of detail. But it's important to note that we're one of a few countries around the world that actually educates children with disabilities. And we've only done that for the last half century or so. Prior to that, kids with disabilities were not included mandatorily in school settings. It was done in a private setting or a laboratory setting, as you can read about in your textbook. Some of the first people to notice children with disabilities were scientists, though. And one of the first occurred in France back in the early 1800s. Jean-Marc Guittard found a boy who was actually raised, looks like, by animals out in the woods and had very aberrant behavior as such. And so he became a case study about the difference between nature and nurture, and how much of his disability was neurological, how much was physical, biological, and how much was related to his environment. And so he became a very interesting case study, and how much could be changed over time with appropriate teaching and tutoring and care and those kinds of things. It's an interesting study to read about. Your book also talks about some others who did some study over time. Goddard and Orton. Orton is the one who did a whole lot of reading research. A lot of the methods that we still use with phonics in our teaching came from Orton. A lot of the push toward including students with disabilities in schools came from the civil rights movement. As in the 50s and 60s, as the women's movement began and the movement to include people of color in all kinds of venues, just sort of paved the way for people with disabilities. It didn't occur until 1975 that we passed a law to include children with disabilities in our schools mandatorily, but you can see that on the timeline that followed our civil rights action of the 50s and 60s pretty closely. The next slide talks about some court cases that were substantial in moving forward legislation having to do with students with disabilities. Some of these have to do with children with disabilities being included in schools to begin with, and then the types of education that they were entitled to once they got there. The Rowley case is a very famous one that had to do with what type of education. Um, I think her name was Cynthia Rowley, was entitled to in her school. She was a little girl with deafness who was a very good lip reader, and her parents wanted her to have an interpreter. And the issue was, should she be allowed an interpreter or just continue with the lip reading that she was doing pretty well with? And the court determined that she was a pretty good lip reader, and that would be enough. So not to go overboard with the accommodations that they were going to give her. And that has been the case, kind of the standard for many, many, many years until this year. A case was just passed in the Supreme Court in the last couple of months in March that raises that standard to a higher level, to afford a student a greater level of accommodation than was given to Cynthia Rowley back in 1982. Some of these other cases have to do with testing children in their native language. Make sure that we don't consider children who are non-native speakers disabled just because they don't speak English. So read about those in your book, and they're quite interesting. The next slide names some of these laws again, and then adds the Every Student Succeeds Act. It's the law that was passed, or reaffirmed, I guess is the better word, reauthorized toward the end of the Obama administration in December of 15. It's actually a revision of No Child Left Behind, and it's the work that the law that will guide what you all do if you become educators in the next few years. It will guide what you do as educators probably for the next decade or so. So pay attention to the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, or ESSA, as some people are calling it, the replacement for No Child Left Behind. It mandates what happens for all general education students in schools. Now, PL 94-142, that's the technical name for IDEA, or the Special Ed Law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And here's a list of the primary tenets of that law. And the first one listed here is the provision of FAPE. And FAPE stands for Free Appropriate Public Education. Now that sounds pretty basic. We want all kids to have free, appropriate public education. But where that gets a little bit sticky is with the second of those four letters, and that's appropriate. We all know what free is. We know what public education is, but appropriate is one thing that's a subject to a little bit of interpretation. So what I think is appropriate, and what a parent of a child might think is appropriate, is sometimes different. And sometimes even within a school setting, we have differences of opinion about what's appropriate. What the teacher might think is appropriate and what the principal thinks is appropriate might be different. And so that's one of the notions that sometimes we have disagreements about. Non-discriminatory evaluation, I mentioned that a minute ago, about the way we evaluate children in the school setting. Have to be sure that we do so in their native language, in other ways that we can make sure are fair and valid. We want to develop for each child an IEP, that's an individualized education plan. So every child who has a disability gets a plan that's designed especially for them and them alone. We have to educate students with disabilities in what we call the LRE, and that stands for least restrictive environment. Now, it's also the least restrictive environment that's appropriate. So for some students, the least restrictive environment might be pretty restrictive if that's the most appropriate environment for that child. So sometimes that environment might be in the regular classroom with all of their same age peers, and sometimes it might be down the hall in a special ed classroom. Sometimes it's in a classroom just for kids with behavioral issues. Sometimes it might be in a hospital setting. Sometimes it might be spending part of the day in a content mastery classroom, or in a special classroom with a special ed teacher teaching reading skills. It looks very different for every child, and so we've got to be open to that continuum of services. This is a list of some of the things that are guaranteed. The new one on here then is Child Find. We've got a legal obligation to go and search for children who have disabilities. So we go out into the community. Sometimes we go to the grocery store and put up posters. We go to pediatricians' offices and advertise that we're having screenings for kids with disabilities. We do all kinds of things that kind of beat the bushes for kids who might have disabilities. That's our legal obligation to look for children who may be in the community who have disabilities and have not yet found their way to the school. A few controversial issues. One particularly is that of discipline for students with disabilities. Students with disabilities are entitled to a different set of rules for discipline if their misbehavior is linked to their disability, and that's a whole nother topic for discussion. We'll get into that a little bit later. Some current issues, one of those is overrepresentation. Sometimes we have too many kids of color in special education. And sometimes we have too many boys in special education. And so we've got to be cognizant of those issues and work against them. And that is the end of chapter 1. So I'm going to close this session and post it and then dive into chapter 2.